Good morning. My name is Elaine Wilson, and today I am here to talk to you about a wonderful man named Grant Wood. He has done a painting, one of his paintings, that is recognized by people around the world. In fact, let me show you something. Here are the three most recognizable paintings in the world. If those of you who were with me when I was talking about Edvard Munch, his painting called The Scream is one of them. It's been 2011 since I discussed Mona Lisa with any of you, but she is also one of the three most recognizable paintings in the world. And guess who's left standing? Grant Wood's American Gothic. Before the hour is over, I will discuss with you details about this painting, details about his life, interesting asides and stories that might in some cases amuse you a little. But let's get started with a couple of pictures of him. There he is as a little boy. He came from a family that was very strictly Quaker. His father and mother met because his father was a superintendent at a Quaker congregation and his mother played the organ. His father never allowed them to read or listen to any stories from Grimm's fairy tales. There was no phone in the house. There was no radio. There was no car. And his first studio, because Grant Wood, even as a child, loved to work with paper and drawing materials. His first studio was underneath the dining room table in their farmhouse. And he also had chores that he did outside because his father was a farmer. So he had his own goats and chickens and ducks and turkeys. And he enjoyed that. And he loved all of his life. He will look for places where he can put chickens and ducks into his paintings. Sadly enough, his father died when he was only 46 years old of a sudden heart attack, and Grant was 10. Grant never really got over that, and I'll show you a painting that towards the end today, that he did towards the end of his own life. And in the painting, he shows an example of his father still tilling the soil. Because it was a farm, and because his mother could not afford to keep everything going, they sold the farm and the family moved into Cedar Rapids because she could make some money as a seamstress or cooking meals for people, and the children, his sister and he, could also help out with bringing in some money from working with the area with doing chores. I think it's interesting that this is the house that they lived in, and they bought it in 1902, and the mother paid $2,580 for that house. I would venture a safe guess that anybody listening or watching this program today could easily write a check for that amount of money. In 1902, that was a lot of money, and this was a nice-sized home for them. During his years in school, Grant Wood will always be interested in art. He'll do set designs for the school, and he does program covers for performances. And he is encouraged by his mother to draw and to paint. And he will, the day after he graduates from college, he goes to Chicago Institute of Art, where he will study. Then between 1922 and 1928, he will make 4 trips to Europe. He spends most of his time in Germany and in France. Primarily in France, he's in Paris, and he is looking at what the French Impressionists and Post-Impressionists have done. Here are 2 examples of the work that Grant Wood did during that time frame. Each one of these is a little different, and as we would say in the art world, he was in the process of finding himself, finding his own niche. He finally, on the last trip, left Europe, and he said, all the really good ideas have come to me while I was milking cows. Now, that wasn't exactly true. They hadn't lived on a farm since he was 10, but nevertheless, he really was saying that he liked home and he wanted to be home and he get his ideas from there. He is the artist who wore overalls, and he wore them a lot, not because he had to, but because he personally felt that they kind of gave him a better image and separated him out from other artists because he was the one who had the farm background. He was always very proud of that. This is a painting that he did in 1935. He's been back from Europe for some time now. But this painting has always been and still is very unusual. It's very puzzling to look at. I will walk you through some of the things that are going on in it. At the time that he was, in 1935, there was a man who was interested in writing a biography of his life. And so the man needed a cover for the book, and Grant Wood did this particular painting for the cover, but the book was never published, so fortunately we still at least have the cover. When he paints Midwestern stories, all of them, in most cases, not everyone, but in most cases, he is just telling the story of living in the Midwest. And he'll also, and I'll share them with you, he also has some other interesting stories about America that in some cases I think you'll find amusing. He tried to paint different types of people, but if you notice in this painting, I write here, portrays unhappy generations of people. There are different generations here. And some of these people are people that he personally knew. For example, Ed Turner is there. Ed Turner was the funeral director, and there is a picture of Ed Turner. You will hear more about Ed Turner as I go through the morning's program, and for some interesting reasons. Grant Wood had to have a way to market his work, and said Ed Rowan is there, and he was a gallery owner, and he was the one who was responsible for helping to market the work that Grant Wood did. There are 3 farmers in the picture. One's back here, an older woman here, and another person here. And then, of course, right in the front and scowling at all of you is Grant Wood. No one's sure what this is about. He's wearing the wire glasses that he picked up the habit of using when he was in Europe and kept it then for the rest of his life. He has a palette, he has a brush, he has his painting, which is on an easel, but nobody seems to be looking at the painting. And Grant Wood seemed to be staring at us. It's just kind of an unusual piece, but also notice behind everything, pushing the figures forward, is the shape of a barn, one of the symbols of the Midwest. Personally, Grant Wood swayed when he talked. He was a little chubby-faced guy all of his life. He kept his nice little round face. He tended to be a little bit absent-minded, and he definitely was quite introverted. So he preferred to paint. He preferred to work by himself. He will teach some classes. I'll mention that in a little bit. And he also is an artist in residence at the university, Iowa University. He is there right to the end of his life. But he is not a person who actively seeks out people. Keep in mind that I said that because there will be some things that come along that will kind of push him a little over the edge. He was very dedicated to his mother. Remember, his father died in 1901, so his mother is taking care of the family, and he will support her until her death in 1935. This is a picture of the schoolhouse that he attended. I'll point that out again towards the end of this slide. But he is known to be the only Iowan artist who ever reached international fame. I don't want to insult people who are from Iowa who might know of other artists, but this guy is at the head of the band. He's considered to be a regional artist for the very thing that I have just mentioned all morning, and that's that he paints the Midwest. That will be his primary theme, and that will be what he will show with around his figures and in the backgrounds. During his lifetime, he painted or completed about 100 artworks, but we can only find about 40 of his mature oil paintings at this point. There may be others. People have things stashed behind sofas and under beds and up in attics, and so we're never sure, but the number floats a little. But mature oil paintings, yes, 40. And he got his start, his first 10 years. He went to school in this little rural schoolhouse, one-room schoolhouse. These are two self-portraits that he did. The one on your left is in charcoal, and it's done on brown paper, which was his favorite paper to work on, and the other one is an oil painting. Notice a couple of things about these. First of all, in the sketch, he has put himself in his overalls. Now, if you move over, you notice that he's no longer wearing overalls. In fact, his shirt now is this very staid-looking blue color. He's gone to be the artist in residence at University of Iowa and really felt that the overalls were not going to really do it. And so he therefore did another painting of himself and left the overalls out. Things that show up in the background in his painting quite often are windmills. There's one there. There's one on the other side. Notice behind this one how he's done the rolling hills, suggestion of hills here, trees, hills in the background, wide open spaces. Last week, I spoke to you about snake plants, and here you see his mother Hattie holding her resilient, determined, mother-in-law's tongue snake plant. This painting of his mother was done in 1929. Her face shows the lines and the stress and the strain of having a hard life and having lost her husband at a young age and having to raise her family herself. If you notice this cameo, it's one that she wore a lot because it was one that Grant Wood had given to her. So it was especially precious for her. When I talked about Charles Demuth last week, I mentioned that he had done a portrait that included a snake plant, and it was a portrait that he did of his friend Georgia O'Keeffe. And I mentioned last week that the pears were pears that the two of them had painted in the garden, and the fruit and the vegetables were ones that she would have had the interest, or she would have had interesting meals made from in the kitchen of Demuth's mother. Here is the snake plant that Demuth chose to represent her. And here is the snake plant that Hattie is holding. Resilient, tough, determined, going to last as long as possible. I want to get to the most important painting he did, which is American Gothic. And in doing that, I'll show you several different slides. And the slides will show you the couple in different configurations. It will show you or talk to you about some of the particulars that he included in this painting and how this painting became important. In 1930, he had done this painting, and I'll tell you the story about that too. He had done this painting, and he said to his sister, you know, maybe I should just enter this in a contest. And he had gone to the Art Institute in Chicago, so he entered this painting just to see what would happen. Well, nobody contacted them, but within a couple of weeks, Nan, his sister, was reading the morning paper and found that he had won a bronze medal. And the Institute contacted him and said, you have two choices. We can give you $300, which means the painting now belongs to us, or you can have the painting back and you'll get the medal, but you won't get any money. Well, they were in dire straits, so he said, no, 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 he just give them the money. So that's what happened next. He is 39 years old. They are living in the attic, which is actually a hayloft above Ed's funeral home. And he and his sister are also sharing that space at the time, so they need the money. This is what the house looked like when he first saw it. Now here is another example of the type of architecture that it is, because there's some of this sitting around in Lancaster County. There's one of these houses. It's called Carpenter Gothic. Local carpenters built the houses that you're looking at, all of them. And they built them from the lumber or the brick that was particular to the area where the construction was. So a lot of the houses are made out of board and batten, which is the vertical line that you see here in these buildings. They all have a Gothic window. This one is along the side. These are here, and of course there are ones on the church. But they were not an expensive house to build. They were quick and easy to put up. They were particular because they have steep gables. The one in my town in New Cumberland has it's 2 stories. It has the board and batten outside, the vertical lines, and it has a very steep gable above the 2nd story windows. When this house was built, it was in the 1880s. Now, Grant Wood doesn't see this house until the late 1920s, 1930s. And he has gone to Cedar Rapids because or to Elton, because there is a former student of his who has opened a little art gallery and is teaching classes and just wants to show him around, be proud, so he can be proud of what he's done. So Grant Wood goes over, and the man said, well, let's just take a ride around town. I'll just show you what this little place is like. So they start the car and go around town, and they come to this house. And Grant Wood said, stop, just a minute, just stop. So very quickly on the back of an envelope, he did a sketch of this house. And then later that day, when he got back home, he did this oil painting of the house, just a quick sketch of it. The house actually looks like this today, but when it was built in Carpenter Gothic style in 1881 to 1882 in Eldon, Iowa, it was called the Dibble House. And in Eldon, Iowa, they still refer to it as that. Mr. and Mrs. Dibble had 8 children. They built this house. It's 504 square feet. It's 2 stories. It has 3 rooms on the first floor. It has 2 bedrooms with the Gothic windows at either end on the 2nd floor. And this house, the windows for the Gothic house were available for purchase in Sears catalog. And they were not expensive. So the Dibbles had bought the windows and the carpenters had installed them. As you look at this, you can see the house now that Grant Wood has done. And he's changed the angle of the gable. In fact, he said this in his writings. The house itself, the gable's much lower than in the painting. You can only just barely stand up. And he would know that because the next day he went back and he knocked on the door of the house and a couple answered it. And Grant Wood had these ideas about who must be living in that house. Well, this young contemporary couple, contemporary being 1930, but contemporary at that time, were living there, and they just didn't really suit the image that he thought somebody living in this house ought to be looking like. So he said to them, though, "Can I take a look around?" So he did, and that's how he said you could barely stand up here. So he's kind of made this a little different. When he does this, later on, the house many years later, 15 years later, the house starts to fall into disrepair. And so his sister will sponsor a fundraiser, and the fundraiser is designed to preserve the property. The only reason we still have the house is because Nan Wood, Graham was her married name, Nan started a fundraising so that the house could be bought, preserved, and it is now a place where you can go and you can visit, look around the rooms. If you want to borrow an apron or a hay fork, you can take those out front and somebody will take your picture for you. But let's look specifically at the house. The house doesn't get as much attention as the two figures in the front, but over here is an awning, and if you slip down, you'll see Hattie snake plants are on the porch. Then look at the apron and the dress. This ends up being a portrait of his sister Nan, who he said he would try to disguise so it didn't look so much like her, because he needed two people and he had in his mind who they would be. So Nan agreed that she would pose for him, and he said, "I'll make you look older and I'll narrow your face and so it won't be quite you." Well, she said, "Who are you going to get for the man?" And he said, "Well, I think it should be somebody who looks like maybe your father. So therefore, I think I'll use my dentist if I can get him to do it." Dr. McKeevy had been servicing Grant Wood with some bridge work. And Grant Wood couldn't afford to pay for the bridge work, but he was able to give McKeevy a painting in exchange for the dentistry work. And McKeevy really liked the painting, so he said, "I'll go down and ask him, see if maybe he'll just pose for me." And he said, so, because Nan was living with them at the time in the hayloft apartment. He said, "I can paint you during the day, I can paint him at night, and so it'll work out fine." He said, "You don't need to know each other." He said, "You're just going to be standing there beside each other." So this is what happens. Well, she said, "If you're going to do this, and I'm going to be older, I need a dress, kind of a black-brown color." So she went down to the local variety store, got the fabric, made the cover, or made the dress, and these wonderful aprons were on sale in the Sears catalog. And they had this new thing on them, the rickrack trim on them. And his mother, if you remember the picture of her holding a snake plant, she had an apron with rickrack trim on. So Nan made sure she had that, so she thought she was all set. The other thing that she does is she borrows her mother's pin. She wears the cameo. Now on the opposite side, we have Dr. McKeevy. Dr. McKeevy is holding a fork. Now, this is not a hay fork. I mean, this is a hay fork. This is not a pitchfork. A pitchfork has 5 tongs. A hay only needs 3. And he's holding a hay fork, which then Grant Wood reinforces with the design on the front of his bib overalls. If you look further at the painting, you'll notice that this family is very religious, and so he's included in his mind, he's made this all up, the father and the daughter standing there. There's a church in the background. There's their little barn. He assumed that they would be farmers that would be they just have their own little way of sustaining themselves. And so this barn would probably have a cow and a couple of horses, maybe a goat or two, and they would have a kitchen garden there. So they could pretty much run their own lives right from their own property. And to protect them, there's the weather vane stuck on the top, and also the lightning rod. When this painting won its bronze award, the Art Institute wanted to have an opening and show the selections that they had made for that year's event. So here is the dentist and Nan. There they are, there they are. They act like they don't like each other. Well, they don't know each other. And they are really trying to portray the images that you see in the painting. The people from around his town did not appreciate the painting. They thought, like this woman said, I'm going to come over and bash in your head for making Iowans look like grim-faced Bible thumpers. That's soft compared to some of the other quotes that I have found that were sent to this poor man who was just trying to make a wonderful picture and use his dentist and he had no other intentions. However, things really do get out of hand over time. In the 1960s, Nan sued Playboy magazine and won because Playboy magazine was showing her and the dentist nude from the waist up. She really wasn't a purist to that point, but she really didn't appreciate that. Because the Art Institute owned American Gothic, they could make contracts with other people who wanted to use it for a variety of reasons. And here you see somebody has done a takeoff on Mona Lisa and Leonardo da Vinci. His cap's on sideways here. And he's holding, Leonardo da Vinci was famous for all of his notes. There he is holding them. This is certainly contemporary enough. We've got a big car in the background. We have a golf club. We have a dish up here. We still have the lightning rod. Church seems to be gone, but we have her. She's holding a coffee cup. She's speaking on cell phone. He's got a phone. He's got a big stogie in his mouth. She's wearing glasses. All very contemporary. This one is really up to date. This one looks like they could be marching around outside on Willow Valley's campus. They are wearing their masks. She has gloves. She's holding Lysol. And look what the hay fork has on it. The most sought after commodity at the beginning of our pandemic that anybody could have. It's taken months, and my grocery store is just now starting to bring back the noble toilet paper. The airline suffered. Here is a picture, a more contemporary one also, of the stewardess and the flight captain. There's McDonald's. How could you miss these two not going to McDonald's? And he's got a Big Mac impaled in the center of the hay fork. This piece has been used for t-shirts, for pillows, all kinds of different ways. And from all of its uses, Grant Wood, and now Grant Wood's estate, gets absolutely nothing. Any time that there needs to be credit given for using this piece and money paid out, it goes to the Art Institute in Chicago. Grant had told his sister that nobody would recognize her. Well, everybody did. So he said in 1933, he said, Nan, just let me do a nice picture of you. I feel bad about that, and I just want to do a nice picture that just shows you just as sweet as you are. So he does this one. Now, I circled what she's holding in her hands. She's holding a plum, and she's holding a baby chick. Prior to starting this painting, she had gone down to the variety store, and they were selling baby Peeps then. So she got 2. It was February. She brought them home under her coat to keep them warm. Well, the one must have been sickly. He didn't live, but the other one does. So now she wouldn't give up the Peep. She carried the Peep around with her as long as she could until it really was not a possibility anymore. And the plum is not symbolic of anything except the background, because he wanted something to pull the background and the foreground together. So she holds the plum. The Peep grows up. The Peep becomes this chicken right here. Now this painting is called Adolescence, done the same year as this one. So over a period of time, he's got this chicken going quite a bit. When the chicken, it's a Plymouth Rock chicken, the chicken is shown there as a symbol of adolescence, and here's what he meant by that. Here you have 2 hens who have been rudely awakened by dawn coming in the distance. And they're just not so happy. They're sitting on top of a roof, the eave or the point of a roof, and they've got this little guy in between them. He doesn't even have his feathers yet. But this guy is all alert. I mean, he's like a child, gets out of bed in the morning and can't wait to see what the day is going to bring. And that's what you have here with adolescence. This is the weathering of time and the effects it can have on you, or the simplicity and the pleasure of staying adolescent and enjoying every single minute that comes along that has the possibility for laughter or happiness. Here they are. There's a picture of Nan Wood and Grant Wood. And this is in a home that he has, that he redoes. It's an old home, and I'll show you pictures of that shortly. But he redoes this house in Iowa City, and especially designs the interior surface of the fireplace so he can put the painting up. He never gave up the painting. It was supposed to go to Nan, but he kept it because it really was one of his favorite paintings, and it was a painting that he had done as an apology to her. I read where even in her later years, and she died in her 90s, and she was in a care facility, somebody still recognized her. In fact, said to her, aren't you the person in American Gothic? So the rest of her life, she was famous for being in that painting, whether she liked it or not. She also poses for him for other paintings as well. And I want to talk a little bit about this one, because this one has German glass in it. And this one is at the Veterans Memorial Building in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The men that you notice, and I'll show you another picture shortly of this, moving across the front are all 6 feet tall. They go from World War I, clear back in time, to the Revolutionary War. And so their uniforms represent time moving on and the different wars that the country had been involved in. This window is huge. It's 24 feet high and it's 20 feet across. It completely engulfs the whole wall in the memorial building. It will be the only stained glass window that Grant Wood ever does. And I think it's because he didn't want to do any more and because the opportunity didn't present themselves, but it also will have to do with the story that goes with the painting. Now, first of all, let's just take a closer look. There is the lineup of the men. There is Nan. Now, she is there as the Lady of Victory and Peace, and she's holding a palm branch, and she's holding a wreath of victory. It's a beautiful piece. And German glass at that time was the best you could find. So he was thrilled to have the opportunity to go to Germany and work with the men and get the colors of glass that he wanted, and come back and with some assistance and some high ladders, install this wonderful tribute to veterans. Well, it didn't go so well. It wasn't dedicated. This piece was done in 1929. This isn't dedicated until 1955. By that time, Grant Wood has died. But this painting, or this stained glass, this stained glass caused a great deal of controversy, and the controversy all circled around the American Daughters of the Revolution. The American Daughters of the Revolution had decided that the stained glass should all be from America. And so using German stained glass in a window for a memorial to veterans in Iowa was just not appropriate. And it will take them until 1955 till the city council and everybody else can get together and stop the controversy and dedicate the window. But in this picture, Grant Wood paints 3 of the Daughters of Revolution. He does not say Daughters of the American Revolution. These are women who have become revolutionaries. He called them those Tory girls, and he also referred them to undemocratic, bloodless spinsters. And if you notice, none of them are smiling, and all of them are staring directly at you, as though you need to understand that that painting, that stained glass window, is not appropriate. What he also does is this. This is French lace. Oh no, yes. And guess what? She's holding a China teacup from China with English tea in it. So you have England, you have China, you have France. What's their problem, he wants to know. Another thing is they try to make themselves out to be aristocratic. And here she is holding this with her little pinky finger out as though she is an aristocrat. He also does a couple of other things. He puts them in front of a painting that he had to get a copy of because it certainly wasn't in Iowa or in his studio where he was working. But this is Lutzy's painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. Lutzy was German. He did the painting in Germany. The boat is on the Rhine River. The whole painting is just a series of interesting things, and you'll notice something else. All of these lines line up with what's going on back here. Well, he's kind of pulled them all together. And notice something else he did. You see the 3 positions of the women? That's intentional. Look at the painting behind them. Look at the men in the boat. Look at Washington at the apex of the triangle, and then the other figures here and back here. Well, when this painting was seen by Edward G. Robinson, he said, I have to have it right away. It was 1932. $7,500 was a lot of money to spend on a painting at that time. He said, this painting makes me laugh. I love it. And he owned it until he died. Grant Wood had attended the one-room schoolhouse that I showed you earlier. He does this painting called Arbor Day. And in this painting, you'll notice many, many interesting things. And in the essence of time, I'll point some of them out to you, which will make it go a little smoother and quicker. There's a child being dropped off by an open wagon. There's a farmer in the distance plowing his field. There's the outhouse with the moon above it. And underneath the arrow is the woodshed. And in front of it all is a teacher with 6 students. And because it's Arbor Day, they are planting a tree. They're getting the tree ready, They are digging the hole, and you always have to have somebody around to supervise and watch, and so that's what they're doing. And if you notice, there are other figures. Back here, somebody going up the steps here, person sitting here, and in this area, the person is using the outside pump to pump some water. You'll notice in the last picture, I think I'll go back to it. No, I won't. I'll show it to you. I'll show you another one where he is standing with his painting and explain something. At this point, though, let me just go on with this program this morning. This is called Dinner for Thrashers. In 1934, in fact, into the 1940s, maybe later than that, but my grandmother had a farm, and my grandfather had died when my mother was 12. And so when it came time for harvesting, she had to have local farmers come for the day and to do the thrashing for her. And if you look at this painting, you'll notice that there are actually 14 men sitting at this table. And you have the women in the kitchen. The men would come to do the thrashing. Their wives would come bringing potatoes and apple pies and other kinds of food. It was a real event. My grandmother would get out the best china, use the dining room table, and there always were two sittings. Because if you notice, on this far side, now here he's put in some chickens. You can see those back there. But there are people out here, men out here in overalls washing up. They are the hired help, and they are the young teenagers who are helping. Only the men who owned the farms sat at the first seating of the dinner table. Also notice this man, there weren't enough chairs. There were only 12 chairs for this table. So this man has an odd chair, and this man is sitting on the piano stool. I remember my grandmother used to bring chairs from everywhere. My mother would be there all day helping, and my aunts. It was really, serving thrashers on that day was really quite a big event. And yes, they did finish the job in one day. It was quite a chore. But then my uncles would go to the next farm and help them with their thrashing because those men had come and worked for my grandmother. Paul Revere did not ride in 1931, and he didn't ride through the rolling hills of Iowa, but Grant Wood has had a wonderful time portraying that historic event. And in this painting, there are just wonderful, magical things children very much enjoy. Now here he is with another painting, and this one is, of course, the Paul Revere painting. After the episode with the Art Institute and American Gothic, and he could not lay claim to it at all, he never again allowed that to happen. He always had, with any oil painting he did, he had his picture taken with it, standing beside it, so that there was proof it was his painting, proof of ownership, and the authority to make sure that how it would be used would have his permission as well. In this one you can see a little rocking horse effect. That's Paul Revere. You'll also notice that there are tiny people in their nightwear coming out of the houses because Paul has wakened them up. And again, in the essence of time, let me point out a couple for you. I won't be showing you all of them. For example, there is somebody up here in this window right here. But this was his interpretation of how this could have been. And it's magical. And as you look at this, it's a fantasy scene. Look at the trees. They all look like little lollipops. And the winding road. This is not the countryside of New England, This would be the countryside of Iowa and the wonderful little fairy tale houses that are located there, and the great big church. Remember the importance of faith. And the church is the strongest, largest object in the painting, much bigger than Paul Revere, but certainly the center of the life of all of those people. Oh, Parson Weems. Parson Weems was the first biographer for George Washington, and Parson Weems had a more than vivid imagination. In fact, he's the one that gets credit, or not, for having invented the story about the cherry tree, where young George cut down the cherry tree and his father asked about it, and George said, "Father, I cannot tell a lie, I did it." Well, here you have Grant Wood's interpretation of the fable about the cherry tree. Look what he is shown in here. First of all, he will not live his entire life in the hayloft above the funeral home's mortuary. He does buy a house in Iowa City, and I'll show you a photograph of that shortly. But the house looks very much like the brick one that he's included here as part of his background for this painting. And over here you have his interpretation of what Parson Weems might have looked like. Parson Weems is standing by a curtain that he has pulled back. And the curtain, just to help give you a little more amusement, all of those little things dangling off are cherries. They're here, and they're also over here on the other side. There you have George and his father. In this case, George has not successfully cut through the tree yet, but he's done a good job of whacking it the first time and done that. Now the father has his hand out and wants the hatchet, and George is pointing to the hatchet. So you have the interesting line coming down across here, and Parson Weems pointing to this. And to add some more fun to it, Gilbert Stuart had done this wonderful portrait of George Washington many years before, and it's the one that's on our dollar bill. Grant Wood uses it to graft the head of George, the grown-up, on top of the little boy George holding the hatchet. Where George is being disobedient and not giving his father the hatchet that he's asking for, if you look in the background, you have a black couple, because it was still the time of servants, and you have a young man here holding a ladder, bringing it to his mother so she can reach up and get cherries off of this tree. This child, this grown child, is being very attentive and caring. This one is being recalcitrant. It was all part of the story. And there is Grant Wood. Anytime you see him with a painting of his, it's because it was his way of legally saying, that is my painting. I did that. As that was about George Washington, this one is about Herbert Hoover, because Herbert Hoover is born in Iowa in 1874. This little house is this house. That house is Carpenter Gothic. I don't know where the window is that is the Gothic window, but it is the board and batten vertical siding, and it was the house where Herbert Hoover was born. Later in time, the rest of the house will be added on. The point of the arrow goes to a duck. There are chickens. Remember, Grant Wood loved to show ducks and chickens in his paintings, and there they are in there. Also, other interesting things in that area. You can see clothes on the line. You see wood stacked up against the house. His paintings tell wonderful stories. Here's a pitcher pump out here, and there is young Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is pointing at his house. He is happy to have grown up in Iowa, but Herbert Hoover did not have an easy time growing up. He was orphaned at the age of 10, just as was Grant Wood. He will become the 32nd president preceding Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he will be inaugurated in March of 1929. Prior to that time, Herbert Hoover, as a young man, had a true rags to riches story. He ends up in the mining business, and then he is very active in World War I, working with groups to help provide food and creature comforts for those who have been unsettled by the war in Europe. He comes back, he has an office with then whoever the president was, and now he is running for office. He is not a popular president because a year later, in October, the country starts to go into a very, very steep depression, and it will take years for us to get out of it. And in the process, he only serves one term and is followed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who said he has better promises and ideas for our country. However, Herbert Hoover really had done some wonderful, important things in his life, and it's just kind of a shame that all we remember is what he was not totally responsible for the Depression, but he happened to be the president at the time. Grant Wood would do a lot of other things with his life, including paintings of people who are written about in books. He does illustrations for Sinclair Lewis's novel, Main Street, and the Perfectionist is one of the lead characters in that story. Grant Wood interpreted nine different characters in the book that Sinclair Lewis wrote in the 1920s. And when Sinclair Lewis wrote this book, he based it on his home state, which was Minnesota. He makes up the name of the town. He calls the town Gopher Prairie. And he takes this woman, Carol Kennicott, who marries a man named Will Kennicott, who is a doctor. And the doctor wants to serve humanity, so he wants to go someplace where they really need a country doctor. So he moves himself and Carol, in the story, to Gopher Prairie. Carol thinks that she'll be able to change Gopher Prairie from being what it appears to her to be into a sophisticated area. And so here she is sitting in the window of her house with her nice lace curtains, peeking out and watching the people in the street. And to make fun of her in a very subtle way, Grant Wood shows that one of her buttons isn't buttoned completely. So the perfectionist is imperfect, which is kind of just an interesting little Grant Wood twist, as you're well aware, he could do with his paintings. He lectured all over the United States on art. He did lithographs. The Art Association in New York City contracted with him to do lithograph sketches, and here are some that he does. He would do the drawings in Iowa, and then he would ship them to the American Art Association in New York City, where they would print them. And it was a fundraiser for them. I don't know what he received, but he would have received some monetary compensation for having done this. But they would only run 250 prints. I mention this to you because these prints sold for $5 a piece at the time. They're out there. And sometimes when you see things in auctions and antique sales and things, you want to check to make sure that they aren't signed by Grant Wood, because he does sign them. And these pieces now are worth, if you have to pay $50 for one, I'd get it, because these prints are now selling for $7,500 a piece. So they are valuable, and they do show the regionalism, the life in the country in Midwestern United States. I love this one. I want you to follow this line. That is the trail of a little hopping bunny that's come down, gone between these haystacks, come out the other side, and disappeared on down the row of corn rows. His paintings are always interesting in what he shows and what he also insinuates. So you want to look closely at them, but also look for his lithographs, because they are still out there, and they're not large, but they are all black and white. They would be framed, and if you can get one at a reasonable price, I certainly would suggest you would do it. I would do it myself. During his lifetime, Grant Wood dabbled in many different fields. When he was in high school, he taught himself metalworking and woodworking. So when he was a teacher, junior high teacher in a school in Iowa for 6 years, he noticed that the children had to stand outside the principal's foyer to be called in for whatever reprimand was in order for their behavior. And so he built this mourner's bench. And when he built the mourner's bench, he wrote on the back of it, "The way of the transgressor is hard." And then at the top, he has carved the faces. One is of a girl, and the other two are little boys. One of the little boys is crying. The girl is really very sad, and the other one is just a little bit disgusted that he has to be there. But the mourner's bench, you can see now, they've saved it. It's in a glass case. It's no longer certainly in the junior high school where it was established first. As far as ironwork is concerned, he does iron work for himself, for his homes. He also worked for a man named Epley. At this time in history, Epley was the owner of 22 different hotels across 6 different states in the United States, and the largest owner, the man who owned the most hotels in the United States at this time. When he does this one, Epley has taken a room in Cedar Rapids and turned it into the corn room, which was their main dining room. The walls are done with scenes of cornfields. The chandelier is this wonderful, magical corn chandelier where the lights would have come out through the tops of the ears of corn. It's just amazing. Grant Wood does all of this designing himself. If you're ever in Pittsburgh and you have stayed at the William Penn Hotel, or you go there and stay now at the Sheridan Hotel, that is one of Epley's original hotels. I kept talking to you about the hayloft that they lived in. Well, this is the outside and the inside of his small studio apartment that he has behind the funeral home, the Turner Funeral Home. The street didn't actually have a name. He gave it 5 Turner Alley as its name. But here are some pictures of how it looked early on. These are in black and white, but I thought you'd appreciate it more if you could see a few in color. So here they are. This is not a large space. It's 975 square feet, period. And he and his mother and his sister, even after her sister was married, because of her husband's profession, some of the time she lived there as well. So they had some separation. They had one private room, and then they had other rooms where there were some separations. But if you notice, here is the door to come up the steps to get into the loft area, which had originally been the hayloft for the 6-bay horse and carriage garage down below. If you notice the fireplace, the same one, and notice over here, this door leads into a little area which was the kitchen. Over time, this wooden board was substituted for this, so people, it looks like people could actually be served and sit there to eat. But this was the space that he lived in for many, many years. Now, why would he have to move out? Well, he doesn't until 1935. And in 1935, he decides to get married, and that creates some tension between him and the funeral director. While they were living over the mortuary, his mother, of course, was there the whole time, and she used to get spooked very easily by the noises down below. She was sure, one night she was sure that somebody had been buried alive or was in a coffin downstairs and was trying to get out because there's all this clattering and banging around. And so finally, she woke everybody up and they looked out, and lo and behold, at that time in history, they were selling bootleg gin, and sometimes you could get a good batch, and sometimes you got a bad batch, and sometimes you didn't know the difference until it was too late. And this man had gotten, who was downstairs outside the building, but banging on the doors, the bay doors, had gotten a hold of some bad liquor. And he couldn't figure out where he was going or which direction to go, so they had to find a way to get to the police and have them come and kind of scoop him up. But in the meantime, the mother never really quite got over it. She always felt that it was a spooky place to live, but it was her home. So there she was with her son and her daughter. This will be the woman that Grant Wood marries. Her name is Sarah Sherman Maxwell. She's 7 years older than he is when they get married. She has been a singer. She traveled with light opera companies. Jerome Kern is the one who discovered her. So she really was quite a talented woman. She also was a woman who was a very flashy person. She loved nice clothes. She loved social situations. She just loved to be around people and to show off and to just be very happy. And she was thrilled to be married to Grant Wood because he was a very famous artist at the time. So this just fit into her scheme. She had been married once before to a man, and that she had a son from that marriage, but that marriage didn't last, and so she was kind of happy to be married to just kind of a Mr. Nice guy who happened to be Grant Wood. Here they are on one of their little vacation trips. Here they are again at their home playing cards. But they are divorced in 1939. Grant Wood is teaching at the University of Iowa, and he says to the cleaning lady one morning, he said, when Sarah gets up, will you please tell her that I'm filing for divorce. I don't want to be married to her anymore. And so the cleaning lady tells Sarah, and Sarah kind of knew that things weren't going all that well. So they got divorced. It was peaceful, and he kept the house that they were living in. And this is the house. This was an 80-year-old house that he bought for $3,500. And he completely restored it. I mentioned before, he did woodworking, he did ironwork. He did wonderful things inside this property and really saved it. It's still there. But why are they in this house and not in the hayloft? Well, this man did not approve of Sarah. Sarah had taken some time off, and she was living in Cedar Rapids, and that's how she happened to meet Grant Wood. And Mr. Turner did not think that Sarah was right for Grant Wood, and of course Grant Wood comes to that decision about 4 years later himself. However, he insists that they cannot live in the loft any longer, that is not going to work. He doesn't want that woman as that close to him and his funeral parlor. So if you remember, this was a picture I showed you early on of Return from Bohemia, and there is Turner. I showed you the inside of this house, this area right back here, because Nan and Grant are sitting in that room where he has done the portrait of her. And if you notice the chimney wall that is there, there is the chimney. If you notice that window, there is that window back there, and the house went in a little, and then there were other rooms towards the back. It was a considerable size. It was so large that his mother could have her own apartment on the second floor. So she lived briefly with the couple until she died in 1935. Grant Wood does not graduate from any college or university, but he does get an honorary degree from the University of Iowa. And if you notice in this lithograph that he does of the event, it echoes American Gothic with the window and with the shape of the hood that they're putting on him. Notice something else. Grant Wood has made himself short, stocky, and with big feet. He has made these tall men with the little feet and extended sized heads much larger, much more noble. And he's saying, I'm a little short on degrees, but he was getting one. This will end up being, unbeknownst to him, his last self-portrait. And this one was drawn as a lithograph in 1941. This will be one of his last paintings, not the last, but he does spring in town in 1941. I mentioned when I talked about his father at the very beginning, his father died in 1901. It's now 1941. And Grant Wood does this piece as a tribute to his father. To walk you quickly through a couple of places of interest, there's a woman in a doorway back there. She's about to supervise this man who's got a ladder and is going up on a roof. Down here you have a woman hanging up a quilt, and you have a man back here mowing, and you have a little child with a wagon off in the distance. Over here, people used to have to beat their rugs to clean them. Two people have a rug outside and the beaters, and they've got their rug on the ground, and they're beating the dust from the winter out of the rug. Here is a child reaching up. He is showing things in this painting that his father would have missed. This would be his father. This would be the church. Remember, his father was a very devout Quaker. But this represents his father in this painting. And it was one of the ways that even after all those years, he was still trying to heal himself from that loss. Over the course of his years as an artist, he would develop ways to show interesting new inventions that came to the Midwest. And here you see a plowshare. And this one is not going to be hauled by the traditional team of horses. This one can actually be pushed by the owner and can plow smaller plots and do it very quickly and easily. You could see the rolling hills of Iowa. And remember the midnight ride of Paul Revere coming through all of that. This is his final painting. It's the last landscape painting that he does, and it was completed shortly before he died. The corn shocks, do you see back through here? The field that has been cleaned. Today, his paintings are selling for $6.96 million. He sold the first one, American Gothic, for $300. His work has certainly increased in how dear it is to all of us and how costly it is to own one. Grant Wood passes away on February the 12th in 1942. He had been recently diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And this man, who wore overalls most of his professional life, would have been 51 years old the next day. He died within hours of it being February the 13th in 1942. Within hours. Grant Wood really unwittingly chose to bring reassurance to our nation, just like other artists that I've discussed with you, like Grandma Moses and some of the others. He came at a time when economically and socially there was a lot of upheaval. Remember, Hoover is elected in 29, and Grant Wood is painting in the 30s and into 1940. His work was popular because it was a way for people to get away from what was oppressing to them. And the Des Moines Tribute says right across the top, the big banner, "Death ends brilliant career of Grant Wood, Iowa's great artist." There's Parson Weems. There's the top part of his mother with the snake plant down here. There would be a portrait of him. The whole front page was dedicated to him. He would be buried beside his mother. And as a parting look, I want you to again see one of the 3 most recognizable paintings in the world done by this little guy named Grant Wood. And this piece to me is especially poignant. There is the hay fork. And back here now are the 2 figures looking out of the window in the house, as though that's the last that you'd see of them. Grant Wood contributed a great deal through his art, through his determination, through his wonderful talent to just innocently portray so much of Americana, American life in the Midwest. Without him and 2 other men, we would not have the history of art during those periods of time that we have. If you have any questions, you can get in touch with me at my email address. Some of you do that. Or you can contact the Willow Valley website. If at any point in time you have a special artist that is well known, that you think might be interesting for people to hear about, or you would like to hear about in a presentation, please don't hesitate to either let Willow Valley know about it or contact me. Next week, the artist is Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt's work is so beautiful. It's so sensitive. She is an impressionist artist who works in France most of her life, only because she couldn't work in the United States and be well received. She had to work in another country because women artists in the United States were just not considered to be anything except somebody playing with paint and paper. So she will add, I think, a new dimension to this series that we're going through. I look forward to perhaps getting an email from you or hearing from you about other artists that you might like to have me discuss. And in the meantime, have a good week, stay well, and I can't wait to see you again. Thank you.